The focus for tonight's topic is on understanding and designing coding for qualitative research. Now, I'm not, in an hour, I'm not really able to get incredibly deep into this. But what I want to do is give you some thoughts and some best practice advice on not only how you go about coding, because that in itself, um, albeit frustrating, is manageable. But it's actually the designing side. And what I mean by that is, look, when we're thinking about the research approach that we're going to use, we have to think about what type of data are we going to get. And when we think about what type of data we're going to get, we have to think about how are we as researchers going to organize that? And how are we then going to be able to make sense of the data that we get? Now, this one, although I've, termed it for qualitative research, let's be honest, this applies in quantitative as well. And I'm going to touch on that because when we are working with surveys and questionnaires, um, although for the quantitative element of that, there is going to be a little bit of a difference. When we start getting semi-structured or open-ended questions, then we're going to want to employ the tools that we have tonight. The objectives for tonight's session are quite simple: to understand some basics of coding as a tool in data analysis, to learn the processes to code transcripts so that you can extract some meaningful data from them, to be able to identify codes and create a code book based on your research questions. That one I might loosely cover, not really so specific. We're going to talk about how to synthesize codes into overarching themes as well. And most importantly, the whole reason we're doing this is to be able to be ready to move from data to an actual written results section within your dissertation. Now, I thought I'd start off by talking about a few projects that I've been involved with, both currently and over the years. I will make no secret about it. I think that coding is one of my most hated qualitative research skills. Doesn't mean I'm not good at it. It's frustrating because it takes time and you have to think and you have to immerse yourself in the data. But the truth is, I still don't understand why I don't like it, even though I do it on a reasonably regular basis. But I still don't understand what it is that sort of grates me the wrong way in it. But let's talk about a few of the projects that I've done in the past and a project that I'm working on quite significantly at the moment, because I want to share, I guess, the breadth, the broadness of how or where coding comes into it in terms of qualitative data. So 30 years ago, ouch, 30 years ago, one of my first projects was actually on growth and development of the Hawke's Bay region in New Zealand, in the North Island of New Zealand. And this was actually a grad school project. It wasn't per se research that became my publication, but it certainly became my lecturer's publication, even though we were involved in doing the work. This involved both interviews and surveys. We traveled to another part of the country. We spent a lot of time conducting surveys with locals, but also when the surveys became promising, we then actually took that aside and we converted that into interviews. And we had to spend our time, I want to say, deconstructing what we learned in or through both the survey and the interviews. And the survey had a lot of very structured questions, very simple rating scales and so forth. But about a third of the survey was open-ended. And that's what kind of segued us into being able to do interviews because we'd already set ourselves up for it. Now, at that time, I was absolutely fresh to this. And the whole idea of coding was so incredibly daunting. I actually It took me days and days and days to just figure out how I can go from everything that I had in terms of the surveys, in terms of the transcripts, and then how am I going to deal with this? Finally got there. And I actually kept the I kept all the coding documents and everything, I think, for about 15 years before I could finally part with them because they're like my absolute first baby. I then went on and did some research on Papakāinga housing, which is community housing for Maori. And this was both interviews and focus groups. And it was a very different feel because the interviews and focus groups were conducted on a marae. So we're in a cultural setting, we're in the meeting house of the tribes, and we're sitting over food, singing songs, interviewing, having focus groups. And it was really quite a chaotic experience because it wasn't like doing a business interview where you're perhaps interviewing an entrepreneur or something. This was a community focus, and people were entertaining at the same time. So as you're going through and you're trying to separate out all of the themes and you're trying to get everything out of it, you've also got this whole other context that came into play. And I mention that because later I'm going to talk about context and I'm going to talk about how it's not just the words that you get. It's everything that goes on within the space that you're trying to have an understanding of as well. Not long after that, I think about a year after that, I did some work on Chinese migrants in Auckland, and that was through interviews. And this was actually interviews with first generation Chinese migrants, many of whom had limited English. So not only do we have the coding elements of, what are we going to do with the transcripts and trying to get the themes and everything from that, we also have language challenges. And the language challenges mean we as the researcher have got to think a little bit differently because we're not seeing everything literally as we would view it. We're seeing it as somebody else who's perhaps not using our language or my first language as their first language. And that poses an extra layer of challenge when it comes to actually going through the different transcripts. The final really old project I did, and I want to touch on this one, not only because it's kind of my favorite in a way, it was a weird project, but I did a project on the globalization of movies, 1955 to 1995. And I looked at 1955, 1975, 1995. And we were actually looking at how movies had deglobalized over that period of time because in the 50s the movie makers wanted to show all these exotic places, and even though they were filmed in Hollywood studios, you thought you were in India, you thought you were in Russia, you thought you were in Fiji because of the sets that they had created. As we moved into 1995, we are in all of those places, but most of the American movies were set in the States. So this one was a bit different because it wasn't interviews, it wasn't focus groups. It was documentary, it was historical or textual basis. So I went into libraries, I went into newspapers and microfiche of newspapers, so tiny little photocopies on this machine, and going through, and I'm taking every advertisement that is available for movies at a particular time. So I chose the same month over, 1955, 1975, 1995. I chose that same month and I was going through and I was analyzing, one, the frequency of advertisements, because, how many places is this happening at? But I was also looking at key indicators of the geographical setting of where the movies were held. And that sort of became a bit different because I'm not talking to anybody for that. In fact, there's nobody I could talk to for that. But I was basing everything upon two things. One, although I call it all textual, one, I was basing it on the words that were in the ads. Two, I was also basing it on a rudimentary image analysis. Now, if we talk about current creative qualitative techniques, these things are in the know now. These things over the last few years have sort of raised their head and said, hi, I'm a new technique. Well, I was doing this in 1995, but in a slightly different way because we didn't have quite the structure. We didn't have quite the regiment as to how we might be able to do that type of analysis. Now, those are some historic ones, and the point about those is, A, I've done some different stuff, but B, it's not just interviews, it's not just focus groups. We are looking at different types of qualitatively embedded analysis through different tools, whether it be surveys, whether it be interviews, focus groups, whether it be documents, or as you'll find out soon, it may also be observational studies. So that kind of gives the history of that. What I'm working on now, which is equally as frustrating in a way, is an analysis of postgraduate master's level qualitative research methods teaching. And I'm working with a few colleagues from Nottingham, one of whom has spent her time going through all the course outlines that are on campus. I spent my time going through course outlines from overseas because I want to find something a little bit different. And what I have to work with is not only trying to juggle where the core themes are, but my particular interest is in finding where are the outliers, where are things that other people aren't doing, or where are things that are new to the idea or new to the sort of courses that we're examining, because we're looking at how do universities teach postgraduate qualitative research methods. So as I'm going through my documents, and I have a pile that's about 3 inches high, um, as I'm going through my documents, I'm looking for all these wonderful core themes as we would expect. But then I'm looking for all these things that aren't mentioned everywhere else. So for example, with Harvard University, they teach a couple of very unique areas, including legality of research, which no one else has touched upon. So I'm having to think, I'm having to strategize my thinking, not only to get the thing that everybody agrees with, but I'm also having to keep an eye out for things that seem new, things that weren't in my mind when I set up the approach to this, but became more in the sense that, oh, I can see, I can see new things that are emerging. And this is why I talk about the designing coding, because the designing side is about being able to think through what you really want out of the data, or what you hope you can achieve out of the data. And in this case, looking at everything that is emerging, but not sure why it's emerging yet, but looking at that and then trying to make sure that you're keeping a record of that as well. Now, let's get into the materials because I don't need to bore you with my stories. I need to bore you with content. So let's sort of get started with the basic ideas. Now, what I want to do tonight is just focus on some broad ideas about planning and execution of coding and how you set yourself up and how you as a researcher make intelligent decisions to be able to work with the raw data that you've got so that you can turn that into and analysis so that you can turn that into writing up. Now, researchers, our job is to seek universal explanations of phenomena, well, sometimes. But we do try to understand what's happening around the world or what's happening around us. And we try to pursue collection of data until no cases that are inconsistent without, a proper explanation have been found. But I want to simplify that because that's kind of a gobbledygook of words. In reality, as researchers, we simply want to make enough sense of the stuff that we have in front of us. We've collected data. We've got a whole variety. We've got screeds and screeds of pages of people's comments or our own notes or whatever. What we need to be able to do is work out how are we going to make sense for that. Now, in order to do that, we've got to think about ourselves first. And this is where the necessary personal attributes for coding come in. As a researcher, we need to have some skills. We need to have these particular attributes, and this is about being organized because coding any form of raw data really requires us to have a structure, requires us to be organized. Now, I can show you some of my coding forms and how I do it because I'm not one for technology. I'm not one for Microsoft Excel, as a couple of my colleagues love to use. I have big pieces of paper and different color pens, and I'm just all over the place. Later, it gets tidied up. Organized means different things to different people. So, you might say, well, I'm not a very organized person. Or anybody who knows me and sees my office will say, Craig, you're not a very organized person. But organization is about how you can think through the data, the ideas, the expectations, and also the information given. It is about perseverance because you aren't going to get it right the first time. You're going to spend some time. You need to familiarize yourself with all of your data to the point that, you've gone through it maybe 7 or 8 times. And only then, as you've gone through it so much, do things start fitting into place like a jigsaw puzzle. We need to be able to deal with ambiguity. And this is because different people will use different terminologies. This is because people will use, rather than saying it directly, they'll use sort of vague, roundabout ways of talking about something. It will be unclear. I have this at the moment because not only is the ambiguity me looking for unusual things, but it's also the fact that in Asia, in the UK, in the United States, and in Canada, the terminologies used for the same thing are actually different. So I will come across, or I have come across, a few terminologies, and I've ended up by just creating it as a new code, only to reflect back and realize actually these two are the same thing, but we have a geographical naming convention that is common for North America, which is different for the UK and Europe. We need to be flexible. That means we've got to be able to look at what we're seeing as the raw data, and we've got to be able to say, you know what, this way of categorizing it, this way of thinking about it isn't quite the best. We have to make, a change, which leads us to creativity. We've got to think hard. You might have done a fantastic interview with somebody, and that the benchmark for that, let's say. We do this fantastic interview, but we also have to realize that the way in which they explain something may transcend 2 or 3 themes that we want, or 2 or 3 ideas that we want. Or they may use a parallel explanation, a parallel discussion, which we then have to say, okay, how do I take this, take meaning from this, and still have it as something that's credible, even though I might be taking a little bit of creative license in how I am breaking it up or making use of it. Again, this is where my experience with Papakāinga housing in New Zealand came into it, because we were in an incredibly social setting. And in a social setting, people behave differently. Conversations morph into different conversations, even though everybody knows you're there for a particular reason. It kind of weaves in and out, and stories come in and out, much like my classes. Um, we've got to have the creativity in how we're going to approach that and take advantage and make use of the data that we get. And the creativity is also not just about what we see in the written word, i.e., in the transcripts or what we hear. It's also an observational element to a lot of what we do with qualitative research. As we're conducting interviews or as we are conducting focus groups, it's not just the concepts that are being discussed, the ideas that are being discussed. It's also the body language, the reactions of people. You know, how does their body language express reaction to certain things that are said or certain things that are asked? And having an awareness that there is a linkage between what we hear and see in writing and behavioral. And I'll come to that again in a minute. We need to be rigorously ethical. I want us to be creative. I want us to be flexible, but we're not cheating. So we've got to make sure that we fully do understand the context of what's being said and what is being said, so that we can use that in a way that is meaningful for our research. And that kind of leads us to the absolute last one here. We need to have an extensive vocabulary. You know, we are not interviewing ourselves. We are talking with people from all walks of life, all different backgrounds, all different ethnicities, all different linguistic skills. For us, it's important to understand different words. You know, if somebody talks about one concept, what are the other names for that? Or what are the varying degrees of meaning for other names for that? If I ask you how you're feeling and you say good, and you say another person says great, and somebody says fantastic, that's on a continuum of okay to pretty good. Although my choice of words are different to those choice of words that are already given. So I've got to make sure I really do understand the nuances of certain words, or many words actually, because it's important for me to be able to recognize what they mean in context, and to be able to say, do I group this with some other respondents' similar points? Or is it actually different? Is it an add-on? Is it a takeaway, you know, a subtraction from what others have said and done? So I think I answered this question earlier, which means I can get through it. Is coding exclusively for qualitative data? No. It applies to survey design too. It applies in observational. In terms of survey design, you know, we often code our fixed responses in a different way, usually numerical, very easy to process on an Excel sheet. But then we also have to code our semi-structured or our open responses. And we code these in the same way that we might code an interview or a focus group. So if you are doing survey or questionnaire-based research, which I know a couple of you here today have done, or are doing, you've also got to recognize that there are qualitative elements to your supposedly quantitative mechanism. So the coding that we talk about will apply into that. Now let's just have a look at qualitative data, because these are some things that we have to be able to think about. And it's also about being more than just words. And that's the most important part. So I've kind of split it on two things. What do I have to work with, and the depth of information on? And they don't kind of parallel up to each other. I was saving space. They were two slides. But they relate to each other in a meaningful way. So what do I have to work with? I have written field notes. So I'm doing observational studies. I make notes. I may not be videoing everything. I may be conducting a focus group, or I may have a research assistant conducting a focus group, and I'm making notes about behaviors as well. It's not just what we get as a transcript. It's our own memoing. I'll talk about that at the end as well, but it's our own memoing, it's our own note-taking through the process that we have to somehow include in our data analysis. And therefore, it comes into a point, can we code some of this and bring it in so that we can see particular themes? Maybe there's certain behaviors we see as we're listening to the answers of other people. We work with audio recordings of conversations. We work with transcripts of conversations. So it's unlikely these days that we'll make a recording and not have it transcribed. And most of us will probably have it transcribed with AI, no problem, as long as it's accurate. But some of us may do it ourselves. We are going to work with the transcripts, and we're going to have to read them so many times just to become familiar with them. A good example, so in earlier this year, I taught a master's level course in qualitative research methods, and I asked each student in the class to interview one person and then share, do the transcripts and then share, because we needed about 12 or so interviews to really play with the data, let's say. And I had feedback from a few of my students who said, you know what? We did a 15-minute interview. So not a lot, maybe about the amount of time I've been talking for now already. They did a 15-minute interview, and they spent 7 to 8 hours transcribing it to make sure that it's accurate. They're doing it word by word. They're trying to get it right. They're also adding in any notations at the same time before they even get to coding. But they're getting the record correct. They're getting that transcript right. We might have video recordings of activities. So this is observational research. This is not video recording our focus group. This might be video recording how people in a public park interact with a newcomer to the environment and watching the behaviors of those people. So we're not looking at words, we're looking at behaviors. We might have diary recordings of activities or thoughts. We might be asking our participants to diarize their day or to diarize their experience of certain phenomena. And as they come across it, they're keeping notes, whether that be, voice messages to themselves or handwritten diaries or whatever. We work with that, and then we've got to deconstruct that and make sense of everything they've got. And we may have non-recorded observations of activities. And this is, again, maybe I'm in that park. Maybe bringing a video camera or even looking like I'm trying to record from a phone is going to look too suspicious. So I can only sit and watch, and I have to make notes. Now that brings me back to my written field notes, but the field notes are my reactions to something that's been said. Now the observations of activities that aren't recorded are reactions to how other people are behaving. Now on that, we get a lot of depth information. And again, I want to emphasize, understand what you want from your data first, because this is where it comes into. We get deep information on thoughts, on views, on interpretations. We get information on priorities, how our respondents view something in relation to something else, the importance of things or the lack of importance of something. We get information about processes, practices, intended effects of actions, even if they're not the actual effect that happens afterwards. We get information about feelings and experiences, and we get information about behavior and actions. Now, why I say understanding this first is important is because we want to be able to say, as we're designing our research, we want to be able to say, actually, what type of data do I genuinely want and need from this data collection exercise? And once I know, you know what, I'm looking for behaviors, I'm looking for processes, that will help guide me in setting up how I'm collecting the research. But it'll also help guide me in understanding where I'm going with the data when I collect it. So the more we understand this, it actually helps us with our preparation phase. Now, I've spent 30 minutes talking about things. Now I'm going to talk about coding and effectively what are codes or what is coding. I told a friend of mine last night, I'm teaching a class on coding tomorrow, and he said, you can use a computer that well. So coding in qualitative research is simply about naming, labeling data, categories, and properties of that. Now, this comes down to kind of three broad areas, but you can find more, okay? It's about words, it's about phrases, and it's about meaning units. Now, I underline this and I put it in speech marks because a meaning unit is simply a cluster of something that has a representative meaning on something. Um, this changes over languages, for example. In the UK, Cockney has rhyming slang. So instead of saying, would you pass me the phone? They will say, would you pass me the dog and bone? Now, most of us will look at that and think, what? Why do I want that? That's got nothing in relation. But actually, it is a meaning unit, a particular, not a phrase as in literal, but a particular way of expressing an idea is actually used. So it kind of transcends phrases, meaning units. And meaning units also relate to themes. You know, what are we specifically talking about? And these are things that are repeated in the data. Now, here's my challenge. With my current project, I'm looking for the things that are not repeated in the data because I have to make a judgment call on the things that are one-off or very sort of outlier, unusual type things. I have to make a judgment call and say, is this the next trend? Or is this something old and everybody else has replaced it and says it's no longer important? So most of us will look for things that are repeated, but some of us will also look for things that seem out of place because that in itself may be enough of a theme to warrant a discussion on, or to actually warrant a little bit of further investigation, you know, going down the rabbit hole to understand it a little bit more. Now, when we're coding, so we've got a transcript and there's an example there. When we're coding our transcript, we need to make sure that we highlight enough text so that we understand why we coded the section in a way that we did. Now, the importance of here is, look, you're not trying to get 2 or 3 words out because it's the words that happen before it. That's a sentence that happens before those words, and the sentence or subsequent sentences that happen after those words that also shape the meaning. So we've got to make sure that we see our code, our uh, extraction of key words, phrases, themes, meaning units. We've got to make sure we see them in context of everything else that was being discussed. Now, this one's an example. I picked it out of a book. Am I happy with it? Not really, but it kind of works because this is a meaning unit. I noticed that the grand majority of homes have chain link fences in front of them. There are many dogs, mostly German Shepherds, with signs on fences that say, "Beware of the dog." And the theme is security. The code is security because they're talking about the fact that this area, security is important. The sub theme, maybe we go a bit more detailed, is security through dogs or animal-based security. But this is a code. What we're doing is we've got something that was discussed and we're linking it to a particular idea. Maybe this research is about house valuation in a neighborhood, for example. And security is one of the factors that influence the valuation of houses in the neighborhood. Therefore, we want to see how many people are actually talking about security as a fundamental thing that's important to them. Now, I kind of want to go into some overall approaches to coding, and this is going to be really simple. Again, these are decisions that we have to make early on in our planning because we want to have an understanding for ourselves of where it is going. Now, I'm going to talk about two. I'm going to talk about deductive coding, and in a couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about inductive coding. Deductive coding is where codes are developed before the coding process begins. So this basically means you get your data. Before you start to analyze it, you sit down and you identify what you believe will be the key codes or the key themes. Now, this is natural because as a researcher, we already have preconceived notions. We already have ideas in our mind as to what we are going to want from our data. So it's not unrealistic to think that they're going to talk about this, this, and this. Now, I've done deductive coding with my current project because I've spent so many years teaching methods that it's already in my mind what I expect to find. So I have a list of what I expected to find. That can sort of, if I'm interviewing somebody, that may actually change the way I go about interviewing them. But it doesn't have to. So maybe I'll keep that aside for a few minutes. We look for ideas in the text. So this could be based on the interview guide, so the themes that we've got, but it also could be developed based on the theory or existing literature. So for many of us, as we've sort of pieced together what other researchers have done, we've also pieced together in a sort of a basic way the types or approaches to coding that they will have used, and we might choose to replicate that. Now, you might say, oh, Craig, I think this is lazy. No, I think it's quite smart because as a researcher, if we don't have an idea what to expect before we start, I don't think we're going to be a very good researcher because everything's going to surprise us at every piece of data. So I think it's quite normal, and I think it's quite smart to have this in mind. What's got to happen, though, is if you are using a deductive coding approach, that's where my earlier comment about being open-minded comes into play. That's important. The flip side of this is inductive coding, and this is where we don't have a preconceived idea of what the codes will be. What we do is we say, let the words speak for themselves. And that simply means, look, we've done our interviews, we've done our focus groups, whatever. We've got our transcripts. As I'm going through them, maybe for the third or fourth time, I'm going through them. I'm now starting to say, oh, these are common themes, or these are common terminologies that come out. So rather than looking to fit somebody else's words into my idea as in deductive, what I'm doing is I'm letting myself think it through and then say, okay, these are what is coming out most commonly. So we let the respondents initially guide the choice of terminology, the choice of coding that we've got. Now, this is starting from scratch in a way, but it's allowing our understanding and our intuition to guide our interpretation. So as we see something, and this is effectively my approach to the outliers with the qualitative research teaching project, because I'm waiting to see what I've got. And I'll be honest, when I saw one university, and I'm pretty sure it was Harvard, but I saw one university that taught legal issues associated with research. I actually had this little yes. I was quite excited by it because I hadn't seen it before. It didn't come into my predetermined set of ideas. But I was also open-minded enough to recognize that it's worth reflecting, it's worth noting down, it's worth allowing that to be a code because it is something to come back to and to explore the value of that. So that's where intuition comes in. As a researcher, we should allow ourselves to embrace our intuition. When we see something and we think, yep, that's interesting, put it there. Use it as a code. Let it be part of the data that we're coming back to really look at and to see whether it fits in anywhere else. I often talk about intuition and research because I believe that as a researcher, we've got to a stage. We know our stuff. We may not be perfect at it, but we've got a pretty good grasp on what's happening. And if we think something is interesting or we think something is unusual, we should know that that's worth further exploration. It's worth coming back to. And that's why coding from an inductive perspective is actually very helpful because it enables us to say, you know what, this did mention something different. Nobody else talked about this, but this mentioned something different. Earlier this year, I think it was, yeah, earlier this year, I was helping a Scottish PhD candidate go through her dissertation for final submission. And she had a number of areas where, a number of areas, 3 or 4. She had interviewed 20 people. There are about 3 or 4 very interesting parts where she had only got a single respondent that had said a particular theme, but it was enough for her to include in her dissertation, say, you know, this was mentioned. Whilst it wasn't common ground, it's actually something that can be explored in relation to the literature. It's something that can be explored even further post the PhD. So there is a place for this, or for the use of this data. Now, we've got to remember, we're not analyzing the data in the sort of the thinking way to write up yet. We're trying to get the commonalities. We're trying to get the important things that different respondents are saying or things that we are seeing or viewing that we know are going to make an important talking point for our discussion. Now, we may also use both approaches. So if I go back and say, well, your supervisor says to take a deductive coding approach, um, sure, take a deductive coding approach, but recognize that you can also use both simultaneously. So we start with some ideas, we let the data tell us more, and we go back and forward between. So as we see some, we might then think, okay, now I've got a few extra ways to categorize my data. And I'm going to go back and see if I can find sentences or phrases or words that are going to fit into those categories as I progress. So it's not fixed as in inductive or deductive only. It's about finding what works for you, finding what works for your data. Now, the coding process is kind of simple. What we want to be able to do, or what we're really trying to do, is we're taking data, we're breaking it up into words, phrases, labels, ideas, and then we're sorting how these relate to each other within, say, a single unit or a single conversation, but we're also relating or synthesizing how that relates to other people's discussion of the same ideas. Um, so ultimately, what we're trying to do is identify some themes that we can use to be able to process all of this and do our own analysis, our own write-up as to what happens. The coding itself is the hard work because we're literally going through transcripts or documents or whatever. We're going through it so many times, we're making sure, then we're organizing it, back to my first skill, we're organizing it so that we are able to see the commonalities. We're able to get evidence that we can cite when we talk about the idea and then showcase the evidence from our participants and so forth. So the process is a little bit cumbersome. It is time consuming, but it's all designed to enable us to analyze and talk about what the data has shown us, and then for us to theorize or to discuss what that really means. So we go, coding being the very real data, we go towards a very abstract by saying actually what it suggests is. The process is what becomes, I want to say irritating, but we'll use the word cumbersome. It just becomes, a slow iterative process that we're going to spend a reasonable amount of time on. Now, I'm not going to talk too much more about other things. I've still got some more slides, but I wanted to talk about doing coding by hand or using software, because we live in the world of AI, and most of us as students or research candidates are always open-minded enough to find the quickest solution to help us, okay? So it is a real situation. If you're going to use software or artificial intelligence to do your coding, okay, just make sure that you note down the actual software that you use, etc., the version so that it can be replicated. Very simple. Software is not required for qualitative data analysis. So I'm one of these silly people who will still do it by hand, myself, because I feel that it gives me a chance to be embedded into the data. I'm actually having a very stronger connection to the data that way. Now, that might be me being old school, or it may be, a genuine thing, but for me, that's important. I use highlighters, colored pencils. If you're going to do it on computer, color coding. I did have a wonderful example from my student, but I forgot to put it in the slides. She'd done up this humongous Excel spreadsheet with 10 different colors, and it was so beautifully structured. And I looked at her and thought, I do not understand Excel that much. But you can do it through simple software, you can do it through complicated software, specific software, or you can do it with pen and paper and a few basic writing tools. The software helps by sorting the codes and the subgroups across interviews. So, we can use common software like NVivo or Atlas TI, and I'm going to show you some software samples in a minute. It does help us. Software also calculates an intercoder agreement. And what that means is you might not be the only person coding. You might have multiple data sets and you're using a research assistant to help you. And in that case, the software also helps us to recognize that there may be differences here and there. But as a researcher, if we're using two or more people, we actually have to make sure that we're all on the same page for it. Why I don't like software or AI, okay? This is my personal reason. Feel free to do as you see fit because it's your research, your projects. But I think software changes our connection to the depth of what we're analyzing. When you spend so much time reading the transcripts, when you spend that physical time coding yourself and making those connections between the nuances of words and the themes that you've got and the ideas that you want to be able to express or that you need to be able to talk about based on your research questions, that gives you that connection. You don't actually get that when you use the software. Software doesn't take the figurative, it just takes the literal. So I used the example of the phone or the dog and bone before. That's the figurative versus the literal. It will actually think dog and bone refers to a dog and a bone rather than what its context is. So software and AI lack nuance unless you are able to teach it in advance. Now, if you're teaching the AI and you're teaching the software in advance how to do this, you're actually doing it all by hand. So that's still going to be good for you. But it also means that your software means that your intuition is not being used. Now, having said software's crap, having said that I personally don't like software, what I want to emphasize is there is a good arrangement, a good assortment of excellent qualitative data analysis software and AI out there. And this is an example of the ones that are currently well used. Now, I started off in my early career with NVivo because that was the only, I think, software that was available en masse back at the time. And to me, it's actually a very strong software. But in more recent years, others have come out. My recommendation here, just sort of looking at this, if you're going down the software or the AI approach, we need to know what software you're using or have used. We need to know the version. You want to see whether your university has a license for the software. So for example, Atlas TI or NVivo, you're going to want to see, does your university have access to that? Because it's expensive. And to get that as a researcher yourself, you're going to spend a lot of money. So I know, for example, Nottingham University has in vivo available, but you have to ask for it. So it's not like here, there's everything here, just take what you want. You have to go to IT, you have to ask for it, and they'll, of course, enable that on your student account, which is fantastic. If your university doesn't have this, it is unreasonable for a university to say, well, you should buy the license yourself because that's thousands and thousands of dollars. So there's where you can look at some of the other cheaper or free tools that are available. And that's, again, why I have this page here for you, is there are a number of opportunities out there. Now, Max QDA, I see a lot, partly because I'm connected to a few of the people who are quite heavily involved in the development of that over the recent years, and really trying to emphasize it as a uh, reliable tool or reliable alternative to in vivo and Atlas. Um, but there are others that are free, and there is nothing wrong with using free software or free tools. What we expect from your dissertation is the clarity that you chose this tool, this was the version. That means we can replicate it later on. We don't need you to defend using a free software versus using an expensive one. We just need you to be transparent about which one it was. Now, obviously, the cheaper or the free software may not have as much accuracy. There may be other issues with that, but that's something you're going to have to come back to. Again, that's why, if I go back to my previous slide, why I talk about the fact that software means your intuition isn't being used, the last one. So if you're using the cheaper or free software, you might also want to do a manual approach to how your data has been coded, and just to see if there's anything that maybe slipped through the gaps. It'll save you a lot of time, you know, it won't be hours and hours and hours and hours. But you might have to spend a little bit of time looking at that. Now, I quickly talked about the intercoder agreement, which is really just about sometimes when where we might be using uh, a couple of people for research or data analysis. We start with the same document and we look at how the two people actually code that, and then make sure that they are on the same page before they process with every other document as it proceeds. Now, I kind of want to sort of go into a little bit of the types of coding and how we can break that up. And then I want to touch on a couple of other things. Now, I'm going to come to these in a few minutes, so just sort of bear with me as I skip through a couple of slides. But basically want to look at the fact that, we have an initial coding process versus a grounded theory coding process where we're trying to make more sense of the data that we've got. And again, I think I'll just skip that. Open coding is about getting the lay of the land. And it's also about remaining open to the possibilities of your data, so not being restricted by your literature or your theory. Open coding is taking that first round. Pick up a transcript, going through, using your knowledge as you see it, and starting the coding process. Is it going to be accurate? No. Is it going to be 50%? Yeah, maybe. But you have to start somewhere. Coding is an iterative process. Even if we go back and we go into deductive coding, where I've got here, and we know the codes in advance, chances are we're going to change some of those as we progress with what we're doing as well. So it's always good to have that starting point, but have in your mind that flexibility. So back to earlier times, have in mind that flexibility about uh, things may change. Your perception, your interpretations may change as you progress. Now, this is going to be line by line, paragraphs, segments. At the end of the day, you're just working your way through the different documents that you've got. Now, all codes are tentative or and provisional. So you might find that you need to reword them. We used an example of security before, that's sort of the one that I copied out of the textbook. The code was security. We may find that that's not the best way to describe that. Security could mean alarms. So we have electronic security. In that case, security meant pets, dogs. So we might have animal-based security. So we may actually change the wording that we use as we progress, because to be honest, there's a huge difference between a alarm or a video camera electronic surveillance and a pit bull terrier that's ready to bite you as you walk on the properties. I want to talk very briefly about in vivo coding. And in vivo, and hence you'll guess if we go back to the software top right, in vivo is why it was there, or why it was called that, is it's actually using the respondent's exact words. So rather than coding as a mashup, no, not the right word, rather than the coding as an interpretation, our choice of words that apply to somebody else, we're actually using their exact words. Now, the problem is going to be when I use in vivo coding, it can be great because it gives me emotion. It gives me very direct, very strong choices of words. But the real challenge with it is if you've interviewed 30 people, 30 people may have very different exact words to describe something. So in vivo coding makes it a little bit more challenging for you to see perhaps the linkages that come together. But what it does give you is very, very good sound bites or text bites. It gives you very good citable words and phrases that are clear descriptions that you can use in your writing. So to me, I would be reluctant on, excuse me, I would be reluctant on in vivo coding with a large data set because I'm going to get so many codes and I'm going to have to then have a second round to think about how do I synthesize these together. But with a smaller data set, and if you like a challenge with a bigger data set, also fine, it actually enables you to use the voice of the respondent. And the big part, the real part about this is in qualitative research, we are about telling the narrative. We are about sharing the voice of the respondents. We're the conduit, I guess, the communications conduit for the researched. So in vivo coding actually helps to make sure that, we're staying on track with that. Whereas if we sort of, take a slightly different approach and we utilize our own terminologies, um, some of the specific vocabulary, some of the harsh words, for example, stopped caring, hated school. I don't know if this is a teacher or a student. Um, oh, I think this was a teacher. I hated school, even better. the strength of those phrases may get lost in our write-up. Now, we can use an alternative type, which is descriptive coding. And descriptive coding is about choosing a word or a short phrase that is like an umbrella for a theme or for a particular topic. We can use it with, interview data. It's great for field notes. It's great for observational notes. Maybe we're looking at people's behavior. So we're, talking about uh, maybe body language, defensive, active. It helps us, excuse me, it helps us to be able to sort of fit things into an umbrella. But what we've got to ensure, like I talked about here with the hated school, stop caring. What we've got to ensure that as we use this type of coding to extract the key points, we've got to make sure that we don't lose the voice as we're doing our write-up. So sometimes we need to find ways, this is where color coding comes in and so forth, but we've got to find ways to make sure that the strong terms like hated school, stopped caring, are still in our zone of attention. So when I'm talking about dissatisfaction, because that would be the sort of the broad topic, the descriptive topic, when I'm talking about dissatisfaction, I still want to make sure that my very specific narrative, hated school, stopped caring, actually is going to stand out in that category. So when I am doing my analysis, when I'm doing my write-up, I'm reminded to use that. Now, the codes itself don't become the write-up, but they kind of guide us into what we're looking at. And sometimes we look at the theme of the code as a way of describing first when we're writing up, rather than looking at the very specific words that have been used. Now, subcoding is a second tag assigned after the primary code. So it's about when we can sort of break something down. We've got our codes, dissatisfaction as my code, for example. But subcoding enables me to break it down into, say, a couple of other areas that are very specific, but may be different. So if I chose security again, my subcoding might be electronic security, animal security, because I've got security cameras versus having dogs or other animals on site to actually make that happen. So subcoding comes not usually on our first rounds. Subcoding will come as we've spent a little bit of time with our data, with our transcripts, with whatever we're viewing, right? The subcoding is as we sort of go through it and we think. And, we do a round of coding, we get the keywords out there, whether it be descriptive, whether it be in vivo, but we get the first round and then we think about it. And then we come back to our data and we say, you know what? Can my coding change? Can it evolve? Or can it be separated out or broken up into different categories as we go through? It's much like the process of manually transcribing an interview. We listen and we listen and we listen and we check that we got every single word. When we come to the coding, we come to subcoding. We've done a round. We've gone through, but now we're going back and we're going to say, you know what? Was my first attempt, because it's like a snowball. The more you spend on your first attempt, the better you get at it. Those first few, maybe I missed stuff. So the more I do it, the more integrated, I guess, embedded that I become in the data, the more the closer I become to the data that I've got, I'm then in a position to say, oh, here's another area, something that I could talk about. Maybe I'm reading my 10th transcript and some ideas have been expressed that I skipped over on my second and my third transcript. So I need to also be able to go back and say, there's more to this. So it's not a one-time journey. It's a evolutionary snowball learning experience as things keep developing. Now, I'm not going to touch on this because I'm conscious of time. What I'm going to touch on is tips in search of themes. Now, this is for those of us who, it doesn't matter whether we're doing inductive or deductive, okay? We're going to be guided by many different things. But when we're trying to get keywords, when we're trying to get codes, or we're trying to get themes, or we're trying to get data points, or whatever you want to call it, there's different things or different ways that we have to look at it. So we want to look for repetitions, so topics that recur over and over again, not only within the same discussion, but between the different, say, transcripts or the different documents that we're evidencing. We're going to want to look for indigenous typologies or categories, so local expressions that are either unfamiliar or that are used in an unfamiliar way. Depending on where we're based in the world, people speak differently. There's different words that come into play. There's different expressions. Malaysians use la at the end of most sentences. Kiwis or Aussies can't tell you yes or no. It's either yeah nah or nah yeah. And you're left thinking, what the hell? Because did they say yes or did they say no? These are local expressions. So we have to look for that, and we have to be confident in our understanding of what the expression is. We also have to be confident in what the meaning of the expression is in context of the data that we've got. We also have to think about metaphors and analogies. So we might speak in metaphors or analogies. We might tell stories to get to a point. I talked about Papakāinga housing. I talked about researching mainland Chinese communities or ethnic Chinese communities in central Auckland. My stories represent something related to qualitative research and related to coding. It's a little bit different than if I say directly, you must do it this way. When I tell a story about what I experienced, it's a metaphor or an attempt at a metaphor. So we've got to look at understanding metaphors in the transcripts or in the data that we get, and whether those metaphors help us to identify a particular theme. We want to look at transitions, the way in which topics shift. Now, this is not about the words. This is about the behavior of the respondent. If I try to, as a respondent, move the conversation along, I'm also indicating in a way that actually I'm not comfortable to talk about something. So it's not only the literal words that we see, it's the way in which the words are communicated across, the speed at which, or the level of desire to finish a particular, sorry, to finish a particular conversation. We want to look at similarities and differences, so how interviewees might discuss a topic in different ways or differ from each other, in terms of their choice of how they express themselves. We might want to look at linguistic connectors, so words like because or since, or we can use a really simple one that we all learned at primary school, and. those connectors tell us if two themes are going to be related to each other. We might want to look for missing data. Now, that's an interesting one because that's a bit different from me looking for unusual data. When something isn't included, I need to know about it. So, for example, when I looked at the course outlines, I looked at 42 international university course outlines for master's level qualitative research methods teaching. 16 of those did not teach interview skills or focus groups. That was interesting. I mean, the rest did, but 16 of them chose not to. That's almost a third. So I have a question there. Why? Was it taught previously? Was it considered a non-essential skill? Maybe it's a skill that should only apply at PhD level. So many questions. But the missing data that I get, and this is not only from interviews, right? This is from the documents as well. The missing data that I can explore actually helps me in thinking through the whole picture. And finally, we're going to get tips or ideas for our themes from our theory. So the related material, the concepts that we can use as a springboard, especially if especially if our focus at this stage is on the inductive and doing this first, then we're going to look towards existing theory to guide us, and then we're probably going to develop it later. Now, there are, some decisions in our planning process. And this is kind of the last on coding. Then I'm just going to talk about transcripts for a couple of minutes before a Q&A session, okay? But there are some decisions in our planning process. And the first one is transcripts. We have to make a decision, yes or no, to generate a transcript. And if we decide yes, how are we going to go about this? And how are we going to ensure that the transcript is accurate? We can record, we can run it through an AI or a GPT, and we can get usually about 95% accuracy. 95% is not 100%, so how are we going to make sure that it's going to be spot on? Maybe what we're doing doesn't have transcripts, i.e. we're doing something observational, or we're working with, like me, I'm working with course outlines, I'm working with existing or historical documentation. So how do I engage with them? Now, the question here is not the yes, no, or how. The question is, for you as a researcher, would transcripts be ideal and help you with the process? The next decision is coding. When are we going to do the coding? Before, during, or after, or is it snowball? And that's kind of the inductive, deductive, and mixing and matching until we get it right. But this is a decision that we've got to make, because if I'm going to go one way and I'm going to stick to it, and that's how I write up my research, fine. Just make sure that's actually what you do. If you're going to code in advance, what codes are you going to use? How are you preparing the development of those codes for yourself as the researcher? If you're using, if you're predetermining your codes beforehand, especially if you're predetermining your codes before you even collect your data, which some people do, coding is a post-data collection process in most cases, but it can actually happen even before data is collected, because it's going to influence how you go about collecting your data. So if you're doing it before, these hinted at in your questions. Do you have guided or biased questions? Are you setting up the respondent to address your codes, or are you setting up your respondent to address your questions? And if you're setting up your respondent to address your codes, you're not doing a good job as a researcher. You've got to sort of scale it back and say, you know what? I've got to be less controlling in that circumstance. And the most important thing, and this is, again, this is a big decision. How am I going to use the text? When you've coded everything and you've got little text bites, you've got little bits to cite, you've got keywords like, I hated school, that one from before. How are you going to use this in your dissertation? You know, in what format, or how are you going to weave this into your narrative? Are you going to have it as part of your discussion where it's sort of loose examples within a paragraph? Or are you going to separate out or do you hope to separate out and be able to sort of have 2 or 3 citations based on themes that sort of stand alone, followed by you having an analysis later on of that? Now, just before we go for a Q&A session, I wanted to talk about memoing, which I touched upon earlier, and also transcripts, okay? Memoing is throughout your data collection phase, actually taking notes. Now, the memoing can be coded. It can be included because this is your observation of the people. This is your observation about their body language, or the speed at which they tried to get away from the question, all of this sort of thing. But memoing simply your own notes and observations about what you saw from the process. If I'm doing a focus group, I'm taking notes about people's body language. I'm taking notes about who seemed to dominate the conversation. I'm taking notes about anybody who seemed to try to avoid conflict, or who tried to avoid contributing, or who purposely didn't talk about certain areas. This is kind of, we'll call it fieldwork notes in a way, but it is something that you can triangulate against the rest of your data later on, because we might have coded up 2 or 3 themes. We might have got some great sound bites or text bites from it, but juxtaposed against that is an observation that says, you know what? Body language was very defensive. There's more to the story. So it's an important element, or important way of um, keeping sort of track of the whole context of the data that you're using. My final, and there's 2 slides here, but I'll do them quick. My final is about transcribing and reading transcripts. So, you know, a transcription can be very time intensive. And this is, again, AI is a good contributor to help it make it easier for us, but don't rely solely on AI. A 90-minute interview can take upwards of 8 hours to transcribe, even if you're using tools, because you're still going to correct them. You need to re-listen to that audio to fill in every unclear passage, to correct errors. You need to be able to transcribe non-verbal utterances. All of those things that give us context. And the reality is all these non-verbal cues are also information. So they may have come through our memory. They may come as something that's audible, but not actually words that we would use in everyday language. We've got to deliver what the participants say. So this is in vivo. You know, it's their language. We cannot edit their language, even if it's inappropriate. If you need to clarify, there's ways to do that, and that's where your square brackets and your corrections come in. But the reality is we have to be 100% representative of them. Now, when we do coding that generalizes, this is where some of the very unique voices might get a little bit lost. not because we can't read our codes or anything, but we might just find that it's easier to deal with those that conform to our description rather than those that are a little bit harder to work with. Okay, simple things like participants' names or others um, referred to should not be in the transcript. So we want to redact names out of transcripts, but that's up to you and also what's been accepted from your ethics committee. And we want to have a key so that others reading your transcript understand your notation. So you are not going to submit a transcript as part of your doctorate, but your university will require you to keep those transcripts and all of your paperwork associated with them. You will be required to keep those on file for a number of years in case there's any challenge to your work. The final slide before a Q&A. When your transcripts are done, read them multiple times, familiarize yourself with the data. It's actually better to read your transcripts or to read your data, to read your documents multiple times before you even start coding. Don't worry about rushing into the analysis. Just get yourself immersed into the data. Get yourself as familiar with the data as you possibly can. And then start the exercise in coding, and then start the exercise in synthesizing all of that information together so that you can start writing up an analysis. It's good to take notes while you're reading, not coding notes, but notes for yourself. Maybe you have a question. Maybe you realize that in an interview you didn't ask something, or in an observation you forgot something. But you can make notes to yourself to see if there's other ways to come back and get that data. And also be very cognizant of, sorry, my throat's gone dry. Be very cognizant of reflective thinking. So memoing your thoughts, your insights, your reflections, your intuition. This isn't going to make it into your research, let's be honest. But it is going to help you think through things as you're trying to bring all of this together and think, what's the real meaning associated with that? So I'm going to hand over to Farrell for a Q&A. I'm not sure if there's questions yet. If there are, fantastic. What I wanted to do tonight is a short introduction to the concept of coding and to the types of decisions that we as researchers must make when we're trying to analyze our data. It doesn't matter whether it's qualitative, as has been my focus, or whether it's been quantitative, because survey design, for example, will use several of these ideas in trying to help us analyze our data. The biggest challenge as a researcher, we design a tool to get information, to get data. We execute that beautifully. Then we get this data that we think, what the hell am I going to do with that? And then we have to break it down, i.e. code it. Once we've coded it, that gives us our ability to start structuring out our analysis section. And then we pick from the things that we have coded, we pick from the sound bites or the text bites that we like, and we put that in, and only then can we actually start writing about that.